Annoying old man, you've tired the whole family. Find another place to live. I found that handwritten note on my pillow when I came home from visiting my wife's grave. 47 years of marriage, 30 years raising that boy, and this is how he tells me I'm no longer welcome in my own home. The ink was still wet, like he'd been waiting for me to leave just to write it. Every parent fears the day their child sees them as a burden instead of a blessing, and there I was, holding proof that my worst nightmare had come true. I sat on that bed where my wife and I had shared a lifetime of dreams, holding a piece of paper that felt heavier than her coffin. That evening, I drove straight to my lawyer's office with shaking hands and a broken heart. By the time I left, my son's name had been erased from a will worth $2.3 million. My name is Walter Henderson, and this is the story of how a cruel note cost my son everything, and why sometimes love has to be tough enough to teach respect. Before I tell you about the decision that changed my family forever, hit that subscribe button and share this with anyone who's ever felt unappreciated by family, because what I did next will make you think twice about how you treat the people who love you most. I drove home from the cemetery with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. Margaret's grave was still fresh, the headstone still sharp against the Ohio sky, and visiting her had become my daily ritual, the only conversation I could count on anymore. But tonight felt different. Tonight, I came home to betrayal written in my own son's handwriting. Grief shared is grief halved, but rejection doubles every pain, and I was about to learn what drowning in both felt like simultaneously.
The house hit me like a physical blow when he walked through the front door.
47 years of memories lived in these walls, but suddenly they felt foreign, hostile even. I could still smell Margaret's lavender soap in the hallway, could still see the indent in her favorite couch cushion, but her presence felt overshadowed by my son David's absence, an absence that was now permanent and deliberate. I walked straight to the bedroom, hoping maybe I'd misread the note, hoping my 74-year-old eyes had played tricks on me. But there it was, lying on Margaret's pillow like a death sentence. Annoying old man, you've tired the whole family. Find another place to live.
David.
The handwriting was unmistakable, the same careful script I'd helped him practice for school projects 30 years ago. My legs gave out and I sat heavily on the bed, the mattress creaking under weight that suddenly felt enormous. This was the bed where Margaret and I had planned David's future, where we'd whispered about college funds and wedding dreams, where we'd celebrated every milestone of his life. Now it was where I held proof that all those dreams had curdled into resentment. I thought about calling him, demanding an explanation, but my phone felt like it weighed 100 pounds. What could I say?
Son, why do you hate me? David, what did Uno do wrong?
The questions felt pathetic even in my own mind. Instead, I found myself walking through the house like a ghost, seeing it through his eyes for the first time. Was I really that much of a burden? Did my morning coffee routine annoy him? Was my quiet presence at dinner really so insufferable? The grandfather clock in the living room, Margaret's pride and joy, chimed 8 o'clock, and I realized I hadn't eaten since breakfast. But food felt impossible. My appetite had died with Margaret 6 months ago, and tonight even the thought of sustenance felt like giving up. I opened the refrigerator and stared at casseroles from church friends, at leftovers David barely touched when he bothered to eat with me, at a bottle of wine Margaret and I had been saving for our 50th anniversary, a celebration that would never come. The cold air hit my face and I finally understood what my son saw. An old man clinging to routines in a house too big for one person, talking to memories and expecting the living to care. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was annoying. Maybe I had tired everyone with my grief, my need for company, my inability to move on as quickly as everyone expected. But understanding his perspective didn't make the cruelty hurt any less. I closed the refrigerator and walked to my desk, the same oak desk where I'd balanced checkbooks, signed report cards, and written thank you notes for wedding gifts. Tonight, I was going to write something else entirely. I pulled out my address book and found my lawyer's number. Some decisions can't wait for morning light, and some lessons need to be taught before courage fails. The note was still in my hand, crumpled now from my shaking fingers, but I smoothed it out and placed it next to the phone. Evidence. Proof.
The moment everything changed between Stati Uniti forever.
I met Margaret Louise Summers on a Tuesday in 1962, outside Henderson's Hardware, my father's store that I just inherited along with more debt than sense. She was buying paint for her apartment walls, something cheerful in yellow, and I was so nervous I accidentally charged her for primer twice. She laughed instead of getting angry, paid the extra $1, and said maybe I'd owe her coffee sometime to make up for my mathematical shortcomings. I built a family on love and sacrifice, not knowing it would crumble with one note decades later. That coffee turned into dinner, dinner turned into walks around Clearwater's tiny downtown, and walks turned into a proposal 6 months later with a ring I'd saved for by eating nothing but bologna sandwiches for 3 months. Our wedding was small, 23 people in the basement of First Presbyterian, Margaret in her mother's altered dress, me in a suit borrowed from my cousin Earl. We couldn't afford a honeymoon, so we spent our wedding night in the apartment above the hardware store, planning our future by candlelight because the electricity had been turned off for non-payment. But we were rich in ways that mattered. Margaret had dreams bigger than our circumstances, and I had the determination to make them real. She wanted children who would never know financial struggle, a home with room for Christmas morning chaos, and security that would last beyond our lifetimes. I wanted to give her everything she'd never had growing up in a family where dinner depended on her father's factory shifts. We worked like maniacs those first years. Margaret kept books for 3 local businesses while I expanded the hardware store into construction supplies, then property management, then careful investments in commercial real estate around town. She'd fall asleep at the kitchen table with ledger books spread around her like battle plans, and I'd carry her to bed before heading out for early morning construction jobs that paid cash under the table. David came along in 1967, perfectly healthy and absolutely perfect, with Margaret's green eyes and my stubborn chin. I remember holding him for the first time, thinking about the college fund I'd started before he could even hold his own head up, about the opportunities I'd create that my own father never could have imagined. Margaret and I would sit on our front porch after he'd gone to bed, talking about little league teams and piano lessons, about the swing set I'd build in our backyard and the treehouse that would come later. Every dollar we saved was a small victory, every sacrifice a stepping stone toward giving our son the kind of childhood that built confidence instead of survival instincts. The hardware store grew into Henderson Properties, then Henderson Development, then a quiet empire of rental houses and commercial buildings that I managed with the same careful attention I'd once given to inventory counts. Margaret handled the books with precision that would have impressed any CPA, and together we turned sweat equity into generational wealth. But we lived simply, drove modest cars, shopped at discount stores, because we believed in building something lasting rather than showing off something temporary. David grew up thinking we were comfortable but not wealthy, middle class but not rich, and we liked it that way. We wanted him to develop work ethic, not entitlement, to understand value rather than assume abundance. Looking back, maybe that was our mistake. Maybe we were too successful at hiding our success, too good at teaching him to see us as ordinary people rather than letting him understand the extraordinary sacrifices we'd made for his future. By the time he graduated college debt-free, by the time he'd established his own career without ever worrying about rent or car payments or student loans, he'd forgotten that someone had paid those bills. The comfortable life we'd given him had become his baseline for normal, and we'd become invisible in our own success story. 47 years of partnership, of shared dreams and midnight planning sessions and calculated risks that paid off beyond our wildest expectations, and our son saw none of it. He saw an old man rattling around in a house too big for one person, not the architect of his own opportunities. And now, holding his cruel dismissal in my trembling hands, I finally understood the terrible irony of successful parenting. We'd given him everything, including the luxury of forgetting where it came from. David Michael Henderson graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern University with a degree in architecture, followed by a master's from Carnegie Mellon that cost more than most people's houses. I still have the photo from his graduation day, him in his cap and gown, me bursting with pride in my best suit, Margaret crying happy tears because our boy had achieved everything we dreamed for him. What I don't have is any memory of him thanking us for making it possible. I gave him everything, including the confidence to throw me away when I was no longer useful to his perfectly curated life. His college years were a masterpiece of financial planning that he never questioned. Tuition payments that arrived like clockwork, a monthly allowance that covered everything from textbooks to weekend trips with friends, a reliable car that never broke down because I replaced it every 2 years. When his classmates worked part-time jobs at campus bookstores or waited tables to make ends meet, David focused entirely on his studies because financial stress was a concept that didn't exist in his vocabulary. Spring break trips to Colorado, summer internships that paid nothing but provided invaluable experience, study abroad programs in Italy that cost more than my father made in a year. We said yes to all of it because Margaret and I believed education was the one gift that could never be taken away. After graduation, we helped him secure his first apartment in Chicago, co-signed the lease because his credit history was blank, furnished it with quality pieces that would last decades. When he landed his position at Morrison & Associates, one of the city's most prestigious architectural firms, we celebrated like he'd won the lottery. In our minds, he had. This was the American dream realized, the immigrant work ethic paying dividends 2 generations later, proof that sacrifice and planning could elevate a family's trajectory permanently. But somewhere between providing everything and protecting him from struggle, we created someone who confused opportunity with entitlement. David's career flourished exactly as we'd hoped. His designs won awards, his salary climbed steadily, his professional reputation grew solid and respected. He bought his own house in Lincoln Park, drove a BMW that he'd earned through talent and hard work that we'd made possible, traveled to conferences in cities we'd never seen. Margaret and I would read about his accomplishments in the local paper's business section, clipping articles like proud grandparents even though we were still young enough to enjoy his success firsthand. The irony was suffocating. We'd worked ourselves into invisibility, become so successful at supporting his dreams that he'd forgotten we existed. His phone calls became shorter, his visits less frequent, his interest in our lives practically non-existent. Holidays turned into obligations rather than celebrations, brief appearances where he'd check his watch and mention meetings or deadlines that required his attention elsewhere. When Margaret got sick, really sick, David visited exactly twice during her 8-month battle with cancer. Twice. He sent flowers for the funeral and left immediately after the service because he had a client presentation Monday morning. I stood at my wife's graveside watching our son disappear into his car, and I realized we'd raised a stranger. A successful, accomplished, financially independent stranger who saw us as peripheral characters in his own story rather than the authors who'd written his first chapter. The boy who used to climb into our bed during thunderstorms had become a man who couldn't spare a weekend to grieve with his father. The child who once begged for bedtime stories had evolved into an adult who found my presence annoying enough to demand I leave my own home. Margaret used to worry that we were spoiling him, that comfort might breed contempt, but I always argued that security would create confidence. I was right about the confidence. What I didn't anticipate was how that confidence would manifest as the belief that he could discard the people who'd built his foundation like they were construction materials no longer needed once the building was complete. Tonight, holding his dismissive note, I finally understood what we'd accomplished. We'd raised someone capable of incredible success and profound cruelty, someone with enough education to architect beautiful buildings but not enough wisdom to architect lasting relationships with the people who'd made his achievements possible. The hardest part about becoming a widower isn't learning to cook for one or sleeping in an empty bed. It's discovering that your entire identity was built around being half of something whole, and now you're expected to function as a complete person when you feel like a broken fragment. Losing your spouse breaks your heart. Losing your child's respect breaks your soul, and I was about to learn what it meant to be spiritually bankrupt at 74 years old. Margaret had been my translator for the world, my social coordinator, my emotional GPS system that helped me navigate relationships I'd never had to manage alone. She knew when David needed space and when he needed attention, when his silence meant concentration and when it meant frustration. Without her, I was fumbling through fatherhood like a tourist in a foreign country, speaking the wrong language and missing every cultural cue. The first month after her funeral, I'd called David every evening at 7 o'clock because that's when Margaret used to phone him, but my conversations felt stilted and awkward where hers had been natural and flowing. I'd ask about work, he'd give brief updates. I'd mention the weather, he'd acknowledge it politely. I'd struggle to fill silence that Margaret had never allowed to exist, and eventually our calls shortened from 30 minutes to 15, then to 10, then to dutiful weekly check-ins that felt more like business meetings than family connections. I started second-guessing every interaction, analyzing my words for signs of the annoyance I apparently caused. Did I talk too much about Margaret's garden? Was I repeating stories he'd already heard? When I mentioned feeling lonely, was I burdening him with emotional labor he wasn't equipped to handle? The self-doubt was poisonous, seeping into every aspect of daily life until I questioned whether I deserved companionship at all. Maybe David was right. Maybe I had become tiresome, clinging to routines that made sense when shared but seemed pathetic when performed solo. My morning ritual of reading the newspaper aloud had been something Margaret enjoyed because she could listen while preparing breakfast, but now it was just an old man talking to himself in an empty kitchen. The evening walks around our neighborhood had been romantic when taken hand in hand, but now they were solitary shuffling that probably made neighbors pity the lonely widower who couldn't adjust to his new reality. Every habit felt suspect, every preference seemed selfish, every need appeared unreasonable when filtered through the lens of someone who found my existence burdensome. I began editing myself constantly, speaking less during David's visits, staying in my room more to avoid being underfoot, apologizing for taking up space in my own home. But the harder I tried to be invisible, the more pathetic I felt, and apparently the more annoying I became. 6 months of walking on eggshells in my own house, 6 months of grief counseling sessions where I talked about missing Margaret but never mentioned feeling rejected by my son, 6 months of pretending that widowhood was my only struggle when the truth was that family abandonment hurt worse than spousal loss. At least Margaret's departure was involuntary. Cancer took her against her will, fighting until her last breath. David's absence was a choice, a deliberate decision that I wasn't worth the effort of basic human decency. Tonight, staring at his handwritten dismissal, I realized I'd been grieving 2 deaths: the woman who'd loved me unconditionally for 47 years, and the son who'd apparently stopped loving me the moment loving me required effort instead of just receiving benefits. The note wasn't just cruel. It was efficient, eliminating the pretense that we were family in any meaningful sense. He'd reduced our relationship to landlord and unwanted tenant, casting me as the burdensome occupant who'd overstayed his welcome in my own story. But maybe that clarity was exactly what I needed. Maybe spending 6 months trying to earn affection from someone who'd already decided I wasn't worth it was the real tragedy here. Maybe the note was accidentally honest in a way that forced conversations never could have been. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop apologizing for existing and start teaching lessons about consequences that 40 years of parental protection had failed to deliver. Disrespect starts small, a sigh, an eye roll, then a note on your pillow, but looking back, I can trace the exact timeline of when my son stopped seeing me as a father and started viewing me as an obstacle to his perfectly organized existence. It began 3 weeks after Margaret's funeral, during a dinner I'd prepared from her recipe box, trying to maintain some semblance of normal family routine in a house that felt like a museum of better times. I'd spent all afternoon making her famous pot roast, setting the table with our good china because Margaret always believed meals deserved ceremony, even ordinary Tuesday evenings. David arrived 20 minutes late without apology, checked his phone throughout dinner, and when I mentioned that the roast tasted almost like his mother's version, he sighed audibly and said, "Dad, you need to stop trying to recreate the past." That sigh, sharp, impatient, dismissive, was the first crack in our relationship's foundation. The second incident happened during Thanksgiving, when I suggested we maintain Margaret's tradition of going around the table sharing gratitude before carving the turkey. David's eye roll was so pronounced it was practically athletic, followed by a comment about forcing artificial sentiment that made our holiday meal feel like a business lunch between strangers. I realized then that every family tradition felt burdensome to him now that his mother wasn't there to buffer his impatience with my attempts at continuity. Christmas was worse. I decorated the house exactly as Margaret always had, lights strung with precision around every window, her collection of ceramic angels arranged on the mantel, stockings hung even though only 2 would be filled. David walked through the front door, surveyed the festive scene, and asked if I was planning to do this every year, with the same tone someone might use to discuss a persistent rash. His suggestion that maybe we could scale back future celebrations because all this setup seems like a lot of work for just 2 people felt like he was erasing his mother's memory for the sake of his convenience. But the pattern really crystallized during his monthly visits, which became increasingly perfunctory and obviously obligatory. He'd arrive exactly on schedule, spend precisely 2 hours making surface-level conversation, and display body language that screamed prisoner counting down to parole. When I'd offer to show him photos from his childhood that I'd been organizing, he'd glance at his watch and mention early meetings. When I suggested we work together on small household projects that Margaret and I used to handle as a team, he'd recommend hiring professionals instead of wasting your weekend. Every offer of shared time was met with polite deflection that felt more brutal than outright rejection. The phone calls became exercises in efficient communication, David checking boxes on his filial duty list without investing emotional energy in actual conversation. "How are you feeling, Dad?" delivered with the enthusiasm of someone reading mandatory safety instructions. "Do you need anything?" asked with the clear hope that the answer would be no. When I tried to extend conversations by asking about his work or sharing updates about neighbors he'd grown up knowing, his responses grew shorter and his interest more obviously manufactured. I started timing our calls, 14 minutes, then 11, then 8, eventually settling into a routine 5-minute weekly obligation that felt more like a welfare check than family connection. The most devastating pattern was his increasing inability to hide his irritation with my basic existence. When I'd take too long deciding what to order at restaurants, his patience would visibly thin. When I'd need to repeat something because my hearing wasn't perfect, his jaw would tighten. When I'd move slowly upstairs that my 74-year-old joints navigated carefully, he'd hover behind me with barely concealed frustration. I wasn't keeping up with the pace of his life, and instead of adjusting his expectations, he seemed to resent my limitations. The final straw before tonight's note was last month's incident when I'd asked him to help me understand my new smartphone, the same technology he'd insisted I needed for safety reasons. His explanation was delivered with such condescending impatience that I felt like a child being scolded for interrupting adult conversation. When I made a mistake and accidentally deleted an app, his exasperated, "Dad, you're not even listening," made me realize that my learning curve had become his personal burden rather than an opportunity for connection. 6 months of accumulated microaggressions, 6 months of feeling like an inconvenience in my own family, 6 months of watching someone I'd raised transform from loving son to reluctant caretaker who'd finally found the courage to fire me from a job I'd never applied for. What David never knew, what nobody in Clearwater knew except my accountant and lawyer, was that the modest widower shuffling around in work boots and flannel shirts was worth more than most of their annual salaries combined. I lived humbly because wealth without family is just expensive loneliness, but tonight his cruelty was about to teach him the true cost of dismissing someone whose value he'd never bothered to calculate. The irony was suffocating. While he saw me as a financial burden, a dependent old man taking up space in his successful world, I was quietly managing a portfolio that could have bought his architectural firm twice over without touching the principal. Henderson Properties owned 37 rental units across 3 counties, from starter apartments that housed young families to commercial spaces that generated steady monthly income. The storage facility complex on Route 9 had been my smartest investment, purchased for $30,000 in 1983, now valued at over $2 million and generating 6-figure annual profits that I'd never mentioned to anyone. My stock portfolio read like a textbook on patient investing. Shares of Microsoft purchased in 1986, Apple stock acquired during their near-bankruptcy years, steady accumulation in blue-chip companies that had paid dividends for decades. The Coca-Cola shares alone were worth more than David's annual salary, purchased gradually over 30 years while he was growing up thinking we clipped coupons because we had to rather than because Margaret believed in conscious spending regardless of income level. Our house, the same modest 3-bedroom colonial where we'd raised our family, sat on 12 acres that I'd quietly purchased from neighboring families over the decades. What appeared to be a simple residential property was actually a strategic land holding worth nearly $1 million, perfectly positioned for commercial development that I'd planned but never pursued because Margaret loved the oak trees and wildflower meadows too much to sacrifice them for profit. The safety deposit box at Clearwater First National contained bearer bonds, gold coins, and documents for offshore accounts that most people only heard about in movies. Conservative estimates put my liquid assets at over $2 million, with real estate holdings and investments pushing total net worth north of $4 million. Old money accumulated quietly, invested wisely, and never flaunted because Margaret and I believed displays of wealth corrupted character. David had grown up surrounded by prosperity disguised as practicality. His college education, his car, his worry-free early adulthood had been funded by careful financial planning that made luxury seem ordinary and abundance feel natural. When his friends worried about student loans, he focused on studies. When his peers struggled with entry-level salaries, he negotiated from a position of security that family wealth had provided. His success story was built on a foundation of financial stability that he'd internalized as personal merit rather than parental sacrifice. The beautiful irony was that everything he'd achieved, the confidence to take professional risks, the freedom to pursue passion over immediate payoff, the social connections that opened doors, had been underwritten by the same modest man he now found too burdensome to tolerate. His BMW was financed through credit built on our co-signed loans. His Lincoln Park house down payment had come from graduation gifts that seemed generous but represented pocket change from our investment returns. Even his current job resulted from networking opportunities at Northwestern, a university I'd specifically chosen because their alumni connections were worth more than the tuition we'd paid. But perhaps the most bitter irony was the insurance policy, a $3 million life insurance policy that would have made him independently wealthy upon my death, purchased specifically to ensure his financial security even if my business ventures failed. He was one natural death away from inheriting enough money to retire comfortably at 40, and he couldn't tolerate my presence long enough to let that inheritance happen naturally. Margaret had always worried about spoiling him with knowledge of our wealth, arguing that comfort could breed entitlement and security might eliminate motivation. She'd been right, but for reasons we hadn't anticipated. We'd hidden our success so effectively that our son couldn't recognize value when it was sitting across from him at the dinner table. Tonight, holding his dismissive note, I realized that our careful discretion had created a monster, someone capable of discarding people he perceived as worthless while remaining oblivious to their actual worth. The lesson I was about to teach him wasn't just about money, though money would be the language he'd understand. It was about recognition, respect, and the devastating cost of judging people by appearances rather than investigating their substance. At 3 a.m, sitting in my darkened living room with David's note still clutched in my hands, I asked myself the question that haunts every parent who's outlived their welcome. Where exactly did I fail the person I loved most? Every widowed parent wonders. When did I become the burden instead of the blessing? And tonight I was determined to trace the precise moment when unconditional love transformed into conditional tolerance. Maybe it started with Margaret's death itself, not the cancer, but my response to losing her. Perhaps I'd grieved too loudly, too visibly, too long for David's comfort level. He'd inherited his grandfather's stoic German temperament, the same emotional restraint that had made my own father difficult to read and impossible to comfort. While I'd spent months crying at unexpected moments, talking to Margaret's empty chair, keeping her coffee mug on the kitchen counter like a shrine, David had processed his mother's death privately and moved forward with characteristic efficiency. Maybe my public mourning embarrassed him, made him see weakness where Margaret had always seen depth, vulnerability where she'd celebrated emotional honesty. Or perhaps the failure was deeper, rooted in decades of choices Margaret and I had made with the best intentions but devastating consequences. We'd worked so hard to provide financial security that we'd forgotten to model financial transparency. David knew we were comfortable but had never seen the bank statements, investment portfolios, or business decisions that had created his worry-free childhood. When his college friends stressed about tuition payments, he'd never connected their anxiety to our deliberate planning. When his early career flourished without financial pressure, He'd attributed success to personal merit rather than parental foundation. Maybe our discretion about money had accidentally taught him to undervalue the people who'd created his advantages. The harder question was whether I'd failed him emotionally in ways that Margaret's presence had hidden for 30 years. She'd been our family's emotional translator, interpreting my practical love language into the verbal affirmations and physical affection that David craved. Without her buffer, maybe he'd finally seen me clearly, not as a provider and protector, but as an emotionally limited man who'd expressed love through action rather than words, through sacrifice rather than sentiment. Margaret had taught him to recognize my love in cleaned gutters and repaired bicycles, in college funds and career advice, but without her constant interpretation, maybe those gestures became invisible to someone who needed different forms of connection. I thought about the phone calls after her funeral, how stilted our conversations had become without her gentle coaching from the background. "Ask him about the Morrison project," she used to whisper while I talked to David. "Tell him about the Henderson family reunion," she'd prompt when conversations stalled. Without her social intelligence guiding our interactions, maybe I'd revealed myself as conversationally inadequate, emotionally clumsy, fundamentally boring to someone who'd inherited his mother's quick wit and sophisticated interests. But the most devastating possibility was that I hadn't failed him at all, that David had simply outgrown his need for parents and was trying to shed familial obligations like clothes that no longer fit. His successful career, his urban lifestyle, his social circle of accomplished professionals had elevated him beyond small-town sensibilities and blue-collar values that had shaped our family identity. Maybe I represented everything he'd worked to transcend: working-class background, modest lifestyle, simple pleasures that seemed provincial compared to his cosmopolitan achievements. Perhaps the note wasn't cruel rejection but honest assessment. He genuinely found my presence tiresome because I reminded him of origins he preferred to forget. The thought was brutal but potentially accurate. I'd raised someone so successfully that he no longer needed or wanted connection to the people who'd made his success possible. Yet somewhere between self-blame and bitter recognition, a different truth emerged. Maybe the failure wasn't mine at all. Maybe 40 years of unconditional love, financial support, and sacrificial planning had been misinterpreted as unlimited tolerance for disrespect. Maybe David's problem wasn't with my inadequacies but with his own character flaws, entitlement disguised as independence, ingratitude masked as sophistication, cruelty justified as honesty. Maybe the question wasn't, "Where did I go wrong?" but "When did I stop teaching consequences for taking family for granted?" Tonight, staring at his handwritten dismissal, I realized that some lessons require dramatic instruction, and some students only understand curriculum taught in languages they can't ignore. I'd driven to the cemetery that Tuesday afternoon the same way I had every day since Margaret's funeral. Slowly, carefully, with the radio playing her favorite oldies station and a thermos of coffee growing cold in the passenger seat. Visiting her grave had become my daily anchor, the one conversation I could count on even though it was entirely one-sided. I'd sit on the small folding chair I kept in my trunk, update her on neighborhood gossip, share concerns about David's increasing distance, and ask for guidance that never came in words but sometimes arrived as strange coincidences or unexpected clarity. That particular afternoon, I'd spent longer than usual because the groundskeeper had planted new flowers around her headstone, white roses that she would have loved, and I'd felt compelled to describe their beauty in detail, as if my words could somehow help her see them. Family cruelty cuts deepest because it comes from where we expect love, and I was about to discover that expectation can be weaponized against the people who hold it most sacred. The drive home felt peaceful, almost meditative, with late afternoon sunlight filtering through oak trees that lined our street like cathedral pillars. I'd waved to Mrs. Patterson watering her garden, nodded to the Johnson boy mowing his parents' lawn, felt briefly connected to the community rhythms that had anchored my life in Clearwater for 7 decades. Our house looked exactly as I'd left it, modest white colonial with green shutters, Margaret's flower boxes still blooming with petunias I watered religiously, the American flag hanging from its bracket by the front door. Nothing seemed different, threatening, or ominous about returning to my own sanctuary after an ordinary afternoon of grief and remembrance. I'd entered through the kitchen, hung my keys on the hook Margaret had installed by the door, poured myself a glass of water from the tap she'd always claimed made the best coffee in 3 counties. The house felt normal, familiar, safely mine in ways that had become increasingly important since losing my social compass along with my wife. My routine was simple and comforting. Check the mail, scan the newspaper I'd only half read that morning, maybe call David to see if he had dinner plans, though those invitations had been declining steadily for months. Walking into our bedroom to change from my cemetery clothes, dress pants and button-down shirt that Margaret had picked out years ago, I noticed something white against the burgundy pillowcase on her side of the bed. My first thought was that I'd forgotten to remove a tissue from my pocket and it had fallen out when I'd made the bed that morning. But the shape was wrong, too rectangular and deliberate to be accidental debris. As I moved closer, my reading glasses sliding down my nose the way they always did when I was tired, the white rectangle resolved into folded paper with my name written on the outside in familiar handwriting. David's careful script, the same precise lettering I'd helped him practice for school assignments 30 years ago, now forming the word Dad with mechanical efficiency rather than affectionate familiarity. The paper felt expensive, heavy stock that suggested this wasn't a hastily scribbled afterthought but a deliberately composed message that had required thought, planning, and enough conviction to write, revise, and ultimately deliver to my most private space. My hands shook slightly as I unfolded it, not from fear, because the possibility of cruelty hadn't yet occurred to me, but from anticipation that maybe David had finally found words for emotions he'd been struggling to express since his mother's death. Perhaps this was his attempt at vulnerability, his effort to bridge the growing distance between us with honest communication about grief, family responsibility, or plans for our shared future. The message was brief, brutal, and written with the same neat penmanship I'd once praised during homework sessions. Annoying old man, you've tired the whole family. Find another place to live.
David.
No explanation, no softening phrases, no acknowledgement of our relationship beyond irritation and dismissal. The signature was particularly devastating. Not Love, David, or even just David, but his full name written like a legal document, formal and final and completely devoid of familial warmth. I read it 3 times, hoping my 74-year-old eyes were playing tricks on me, hoping that grief had finally affected my vision the way it had impacted everything else about my daily functioning. But the words remained unchanged, the meaning crystal clear, the location of delivery, my wife's pillow, in our most intimate space, adding layers of cruelty that felt almost artistic in their precision. I sat on the edge of our bed for exactly 17 minutes after reading David's note, holding that piece of paper like evidence in a trial where I was simultaneously victim, jury, and judge. The silence in the house wasn't peaceful anymore. It was accusatory, filled with the echo of 40 years of sacrifice that had apparently meant nothing to the person I'd sacrificed everything for. Some bridges you don't burn. You dismantle them stone by stone, and I was about to begin the most methodical demolition of my adult life. The walk to my car felt surreal, like moving through someone else's nightmare, but my hands were steady as I started the engine and backed out of the driveway that David apparently considered his to give away. Henry Caldwell's law office was only 12 minutes from our house, but the drive stretched into an eternity of crystal-clear thinking that felt almost supernatural in its precision. Every stoplight became an opportunity to reconsider, every turn a chance to choose forgiveness over justice, but with each passing block my resolve hardened like concrete setting around steel rebar. This wasn't about anger, though fury was certainly present. This wasn't about revenge, though retribution would certainly result. This was about teaching a lesson that 40 years of gentle parenting had apparently failed to deliver. Actions have consequences, cruelty has costs, and family obligations run both directions regardless of convenience or preference. The evening light was fading as I pulled into the parking space outside Caldwell and Associates, the same modest law office where Henry had handled our real estate transactions, business incorporations, and estate planning for nearly 30 years. His secretary had gone home, but Henry's car was still in its designated spot, and I knew he'd be working late on case preparation the way he always did on Tuesday evenings. The man had been Margaret's college classmate, my business attorney, and one of the few people in Clearwater who understood the true scope of our financial situation without being impressed by it or treating us differently because of it. Tonight, he was about to become the instrument of David's education about respect, gratitude, and the devastating consequences of taking family for granted. Henry answered his office door with a surprised smile of someone greeting an unexpected but welcome visitor. His suit jacket hung over his desk chair, his sleeves rolled up for serious work. "Walter, what brings you out this late?"
Everything all right?
The concern in his voice was genuine, the kind of professional warmth that came from decades of friendship rather than mere client relationships. I handed him David's note without explanation, watched his expression shift from confusion to comprehension to something approaching horror as he read the brief, brutal message that had changed everything between father and son in less than 50 words.
Jesus, Walt.
"I'm so sorry. What do you want to do?" The question was perfect in its simplicity, its assumption that action rather than discussion was required, its recognition that some insults demand immediate and proportional response. I'd always appreciated Henry's directness, his ability to translate emotional decisions into legal language without judgment or lengthy consultation about motivation. Tonight, that efficiency was exactly what I needed to transform hurt into justice with surgical precision. "I want David removed from my will completely."
Tonight. Everything goes to St. Mary S. Hospital and the Children's Cancer Research Foundation. He gets nothing. Not the house, not the investments, not the insurance policy. Nothing.
My voice was calmer than I'd expected, steady and certain in ways that surprised even me. This wasn't a decision made in emotional turmoil, but a calculated response to information that had clarified exactly where I stood in my son's hierarchy of importance. Henry nodded slowly, his legal mind already processing the mechanics of what I was requesting, while his personal understanding recognized the finality of what I was choosing. "Walt, this is a big decision. Maybe you should take some time to—" I cut him off gently but firmly. "Henry, I've had 40 years to take time. I've had 6 months of watching him treat me like an inconvenience. I've had 30 minutes to process being evicted from my own home by someone I raised to be better than this.
The time for consideration is over."
This is about dignity, respect, and teaching lessons that should have been learned decades ago. He pulled out the file containing our estate documents, his movements deliberate and respectful of the gravity of what we were about to accomplish. "I need you to understand that this is irrevocable. Once we file these changes, once you sign these documents, there's no simple way to undo them."
Are you absolutely certain?
I thought about David's handwriting on that note, about the calculated cruelty of leaving it on Margaret's pillow, about 40 years of love being dismissed as 40 years of burden. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Henry's office felt different as we began the process of dismantling 40 years of estate planning. Smaller somehow, as if the weight of what we were doing had compressed the air itself into something dense and ceremonial. A will is more than money. It's the final love letter you leave behind, and tonight I was writing a different kind of message than the one I'd crafted with Margaret's gentle guidance decades earlier. The original document had been created with such hope, such careful consideration of David's future needs and our family's continued prosperity beyond our lifetimes. We debated every clause, every contingency, every possibility that might affect our son's inheritance and security. Margaret had insisted on educational trusts, charitable giving provisions, and language that would encourage David to use our resources responsibly rather than simply consume them carelessly. Now I was reducing 4 decades of thoughtful planning to a single brutal lesson about consequences. Henry pulled up the estate files on his computer while I sat in the leather chair where Margaret and I had made so many important decisions together. Business incorporations, property acquisitions, retirement planning sessions that now felt like artifacts from someone else's life. The blue glow of his monitor illuminated documents that represented our life's work, our accumulated sacrifices, our hopes for generational wealth that could benefit children and grandchildren we dreamed about during quiet evening conversations. Each asset listed told a story. The commercial properties purchased with careful analysis, the stock portfolios built through patient reinvestment, the insurance policies designed to protect against catastrophic loss. "Let's start with the primary residence," Henry said, his voice professional but gentle, understanding that each change represented an emotional amputation. The house where David had learned to walk, where he'd brought friends for birthday parties, where Margaret had taught him to cook her famous pot roast. Now it would belong to St. Mary's Hospital instead of continuing our family legacy. I could almost hear his voice as a 7-year-old asking if this would always be his home, and my promise that it would be his someday. Someday had been cancelled by a handwritten note. The investment portfolio was next, shares in companies we'd researched together, mutual funds that had grown steadily over decades, retirement accounts that had been intended to provide David with financial freedom his children might never need to worry about. Each transfer to the Children's Cancer Research Foundation felt like erasing a conversation Margaret and I had shared about compound interest, about leaving something meaningful for future generations, about the responsibility that came with inherited wealth. The life insurance policies are substantial, Henry noted, scrolling through coverage amounts that most people never accumulated in liquid assets. $3 million in death benefits that David had never known existed, purchased quietly over the years as our income grew and our business ventures flourished. Margaret had suggested the coverage during one of our annual financial reviews, arguing that unexpected death shouldn't diminish David's opportunities or force difficult decisions during grieving periods. Tonight, that protection was being redirected to organizations that would actually appreciate the gift. The business holdings required more complex language. Henderson Properties would dissolve upon my death, with assets distributed to local charities rather than transferred to family management. The storage facility, the rental properties, the commercial buildings that generated steady monthly income would benefit people who needed housing assistance and medical care rather than someone who found my existence burdensome. Each change felt simultaneously devastating and liberating, like cutting away infected tissue to save healthy organs. Henry worked with methodical precision, his fingers moving across the keyboard as he translated my emotional decisions into legal terminology that would survive court challenges and probate procedures. Walter, I need to ask about personal items, family photos, heirlooms, things with sentimental value rather than monetary worth. The question stopped me cold. Margaret's engagement ring, her grandmother's china, photo albums documenting David's childhood, Christmas ornaments collected over 47 years of marriage, objects that told our family story in ways that money never could. For a moment, my resolve wavered. But then I remembered the location where David had chosen to deliver his dismissal, how he'd violated our most intimate space to communicate his cruelest thoughts.
Everything.
He gets nothing that connects him to this family. Nothing that belonged to his mother. Nothing that represents the love he's decided to throw away. Henry nodded grimly and continued typing. The documents were signed, notarized, and filed by 8:30 that evening, but I sat in Henry's office for another 20 minutes staring at the copies of what I'd just accomplished, trying to process the magnitude of what couldn't be undone. Justice feels cold when it's served to someone you once held as a baby, and the institutional efficiency of legal paperwork felt brutally inadequate for the emotional earthquake I'd just triggered. Henry had offered coffee, but my hands were shaking too much to trust myself with hot liquids, and besides, everything tasted like sawdust since Margaret died anyway. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. 30 years of friendship had taught us both when words were necessary and when they were simply inadequate for the moment's gravity. My lawyer understood that I'd just performed emergency surgery on my own heart, excising the infected relationship that was poisoning everything else about my remaining years. Walking back to my car, I felt simultaneously lighter and heavier than I had in months. Lighter because I'd finally taken action instead of absorbing endless disrespect, heavier because that action had permanently altered the trajectory of my family's story. The evening air was crisp with autumn approaching, and I could smell burning leaves from someone's backyard, the scent triggering memories of raking piles with a 7-year-old David who would jump into them with abandon, trusting that I'd catch him if he fell wrong. Tonight, I'd let him fall in ways he couldn't even imagine yet. The drive home felt different, like returning to a house I'd never seen before even though every street corner held decades of familiarity. This was still my neighborhood, my route, my community, but I was returning as a different person than the one who'd left 2 hours earlier. The man who'd driven to Henry's office had been a father desperately hoping to preserve family relationships despite mounting evidence that those relationships were already dead. The man driving home was someone who'd chosen dignity over delusion, consequences over comfortable denial. Our house looked exactly the same under the porch light Margaret had insisted we leave on for security, but I knew David's note was still lying on our bedroom dresser where I'd left it, still containing the same brutal dismissal that had changed everything between us. The difference was that now it was evidence in a case that had already been tried, judged, and sentenced. Justice had been served with legal precision, though the defendant wouldn't learn about his conviction until my death made the verdict public. Inside, I poured myself 2 fingers of the bourbon Margaret had bought me for our last anniversary, sat in my recliner with the television off, and allowed myself to really feel what I'd done. This wasn't celebration or satisfaction. It was grief of a different kind, mourning for the relationship that could have been, should have been, but apparently never would be. I'd raised a son who saw family as expendable, love as conditional, and respect as optional. Tonight's decision was simply acknowledging reality rather than creating it. The phone rang at 9:15, David's weekly obligation call, perfectly timed as always, delivered with the enthusiasm of someone completing an unpleasant chore.
Hey Dad, just checking in.
How was your day? His voice carried the same detached politeness he'd use with a grocery store clerk, no genuine interest in the answer, no awareness that his day had included writing his father's eviction notice and leaving it on his dead mother's pillow.
Fine. Son. Everything is fine.
My voice was steadier than I'd expected, calm in ways that felt almost supernatural. There was no point in dramatic revelations or emotional confrontations. He'd learn about tonight's consequences when consequences mattered, when the lesson could be absorbed completely without opportunity for manipulation or negotiation. We talked for exactly 6 minutes about weather, about his work schedule, about nothing meaningful enough to remember, and when he hung up with his usual, "Talk to you next week," I realized it might be our last conversation as father and son in any traditional sense. Next week, I'd still be his biological father, but he'd no longer be my heir, my legacy, or my priority. That transition felt more significant than any graduation, more final than any funeral, more decisive than any divorce. I'd officially retired from the exhausting job of loving someone who found that love burdensome. 3 weeks passed in blessed silence before David's world collapsed, and the beautiful irony was that he learned about my wealth the same way most shocking family secrets are revealed, through small-town gossip at the worst possible moment. He learned about my millions the same way he learned about my pain. Too late, from strangers, with no opportunity to fix what his ignorance had destroyed. The revelation came during a routine coffee meeting with his biggest client, Morrison Development, at Clearwater's only upscale cafe, a place that served artisanal everything to people who wanted to feel cosmopolitan in a town of 8,000. David was presenting plans for a new commercial complex when Patricia Morrison casually mentioned how fortunate he was to have such a successful father, how impressed she'd been when she discovered that the unassuming man she'd seen around town was actually the Walter Henderson, owner of half the commercial real estate in 3 counties. The conversation stopped mid-sentence as David's brain processed information that didn't match anything he thought he knew about his family. "I'm sorry, what did you say about my father?" Patricia's confusion was visible as she realized she'd accidentally revealed something David apparently didn't know. "Henderson Properties?
Your father has a company?
He's been our biggest competitor for commercial development for 20 years. We've tried to buy him out dozens of times, but he's never interested in selling. Brilliant investor, really. Conservative approach, but incredibly successful." The architectural plans spread across their table suddenly felt insignificant compared to the earthquake happening in David's understanding of his own life story. Morrison Development had annual revenues in the tens of millions, and Patricia Morrison was describing his modest, flannel-wearing father as their biggest competitor, someone whose business was substantial enough to repeatedly decline buyout offers from one of the region's most successful firms. The coffee in his mouth turned bitter as David excused himself, claiming a sudden emergency that required immediate attention. The 20-minute drive from downtown Clearwater to our house felt like traveling through an alternate universe where everything familiar had been replaced by identical-looking counterfeits that meant something completely different. David's hands shook as he Googled Henderson Properties on his phone in our driveway, watching search results populate with property records, business filings, and newspaper articles about commercial developments that bore our family name. The storage facility complex he'd driven past thousands of times, the office buildings where he'd interviewed for part-time jobs during high school, the apartment complex where his college girlfriend had lived, all owned by Henderson Properties, all managed by the same man he'd dismissed as an annoying burden who needed to find somewhere else to live. Public record searches revealed property values, tax assessments, and business registrations that painted a picture of systematic wealth accumulation over 4 decades. The numbers were staggering. Commercial holdings worth millions, residential rental properties generating 6-figure annual income, land investments that had appreciated exponentially since their initial purchase dates in the 1980s and 1990s. His modest father, the man who'd driven the same pickup truck for 15 years and shopped with grocery store coupons, had quietly assembled a business empire worth more than David's entire architectural firm. But the truly devastating discovery came when he called his own bank, the regional institution where he'd maintained accounts since college, only to learn that his student loan cosigner was listed in their system as a high-net-worth individual with assets exceeding their standard lending thresholds. His car loans, his mortgage, his business credit lines, all had been approved not because of his own financial standing but because of his father's substantial backing that David had never known existed. The loan officer, assuming David was aware of his family's financial status, mentioned how unusual it was for someone with Walter Henderson's resources to co-sign rather than simply pay outright, how the bank had always appreciated the conservative approach that built credit while maintaining liquidity for larger investments. David sat in our driveway for over an hour, engine off, phone calls completed, staring at the same modest house that now looked like an elaborate disguise hiding secrets that redefined everything he thought he understood about his childhood, his opportunities, and his own achievements. David's first call came at 6:30 that same evening, 45 minutes after his discovery in our driveway, and the desperation in his voice was immediately apparent even through the phone's tinny speaker. Desperation makes people honest, but honesty doesn't erase cruelty, and I was about to learn exactly how much my son's newfound respect was worth when measured against his financial self-interest. His voice cracked as he stammered through an apology that felt rehearsed yet panicked, as if he'd spent those 45 minutes crafting the perfect combination of remorse and explanation that might undo 3 weeks of consequences he didn't even know had been triggered.
Dad, I need to talk to you.
I made a terrible mistake. I was stressed about work, about Mom's death, about everything changing so fast. I never meant what I wrote in that note.
Can I come over? Can we talk?
The words tumbled out in a rush that suggested genuine emotion, but I'd heard similar panic in his voice before, when he'd crashed his car senior year, when he'd failed his first architecture licensing exam, when crisis demanded immediate parental rescue rather than genuine accountability. This felt identical, emergency-induced remorse designed to restore previous status rather than acknowledge fundamental problems with his character. I agreed to see him, curious about what approach he'd take now that our power dynamic had shifted so dramatically. When David arrived 20 minutes later, he looked genuinely shaken, pale, disheveled, moving with the careful precision of someone who'd realized they were standing in a minefield they'd accidentally created. He sat across from me in our living room, the same space where we'd shared thousands of conversations over 30 years, but tonight felt like our first meeting between strangers negotiating terms neither fully understood. His apology was comprehensive and seemed heartfelt, covering not just the note but months of accumulated disrespect, years of taking my presence for granted, decades of failing to appreciate sacrifices that had apparently been invisible until today's revelation. He talked about grief affecting his judgment, about feeling overwhelmed by responsibility for his aging father, about making decisions from exhaustion rather than malice. The performance was impressive, hitting every note of remorse and recognition that might have moved me 3 weeks earlier. But watching him work so hard to repair damage he'd only noticed after discovering its financial cost revealed something ugly about his motivations. David's contrition was directly proportional to his awareness of what he stood to lose. his emotional investment increasing in perfect correlation with his understanding of my net worth. This wasn't moral awakening but economic panic disguised as family healing. When he finished his prepared remarks, the silence stretched between us like a chasm that couldn't be crossed with words alone. I could see him calculating, trying to read my expression for signs of forgiveness, hope, or weakness that might suggest his campaign was succeeding. His eyes kept darting around our modest living room as if seeing it for the first time, probably wondering what other secrets were hidden behind our deliberately unremarkable facade.
I understand you're hurt, Dad.
I understand I was cruel and ungrateful. But we're family. Family forgives each other, right? We work through problems together. We don't just give up on each other. The manipulation was subtle but unmistakable, positioning forgiveness as my obligation rather than his earned privilege, framing reconciliation as inevitable rather than conditional on genuine change. He was lobbying for restoration of previous status without demonstrating any real understanding of what had been damaged or why his behavior had been unacceptable beyond its financial consequences. I let him talk for nearly an hour, watching him exhaust every argument he could construct for why our relationship should return to its previous dynamic. When he finally paused, waiting for my response, I realized he still hadn't asked the most important question. Not, will you forgive me? But how can I earn back your respect? The omission was telling. David wanted absolution without transformation, reconciliation without accountability, family benefits without family responsibilities. He'd discovered my wealth and decided our relationship was worth preserving, but only because preservation now served his interests rather than mine. Son, I said finally, 3 weeks ago you wanted me out of this house.
Tonight you want back into my life.
What changed? His answer would determine whether this conversation continued or whether his education about consequences was just beginning. David's answer to my question came after a long pause, and in that silence I could practically hear the gears turning as he tried to craft a response that wouldn't reveal the obvious truth we both understood.
Nothing changed, Dad.
I realized I was wrong. I realized I was hurting someone I love. His voice carried the practiced sincerity of someone who'd learned to navigate difficult conversations through charm rather than honesty, but we both knew exactly what had changed, and it wasn't his capacity for love. Forgiveness is divine, but dignity is human, and sometimes we choose humanity over the higher road that leads nowhere but continued exploitation. I studied his face across our coffee table, the same earnest expression he'd perfected during childhood explanations for broken windows and missing homework, and I realized that 30 years later, he was still trying to talk his way out of consequences rather than accepting responsibility for choices. The man sitting in my living room was successful, articulate, professionally accomplished, and morally bankrupt in ways that no amount of education or opportunity could have corrected. This wasn't about grief or stress or temporary poor judgment. This was about character, and character doesn't change because bank account information becomes available.
David, let me ask you something different.
If you'd never learned about Henderson Properties, if Patricia Morrison hadn't mentioned my business holdings, would you be here tonight apologizing for that note? The question hung between us like a sword waiting to fall, and I watched him struggle with whether to maintain his performance or acknowledge the reality that had brought him to my door. His hesitation was answer enough, but he pressed forward anyway, trying to construct a narrative that preserved both his dignity and his inheritance prospects. Of course, I would have apologized eventually. I was already feeling terrible about what I'd written. Today just made me realize how much I'd hurt you. The lie was beautifully crafted and completely unconvincing, delivered with just enough uncertainty to seem vulnerable while maintaining plausible deniability about his motivations. David had always been intelligent, but tonight his intelligence felt weaponized against the truth rather than serving it. I thought about Margaret, about what she would have wanted me to do in this situation, about whether forgiveness was really the Christian response or whether enabling cruel behavior was actually the greater sin. She'd always believed in second chances, in the power of love to transform people, in family bonds that could survive almost anything. But she'd also believed in accountability, in natural consequences, in teaching lessons that prevented worse behavior down the road. What would she say about a son who only valued his father after discovering his father's net worth? "Let me tell you what I think happened," I said, leaning back in my chair and watching his expression carefully. "I think you wrote that note because you genuinely found my presence burdensome, and you meant every word of it. I think you've been planning to push me out of this house for months, waiting for the right moment to suggest I'd be happier in assisted living or some other arrangement that would free you from the inconvenience of aging parents. I think today you discovered that your annoying old father is worth more money than you've ever imagined, and suddenly my presence doesn't seem quite so burdensome anymore." His face flushed red, but he couldn't interrupt, because we both knew I was describing exactly what had happened with surgical precision. "The problem, son, is that respect motivated by financial interest isn't respect at all. It's just another form of calculation. You're not here because you love me or because you realized you were wrong to treat me cruelly. You're here because you discovered I'm a financial asset rather than a liability, and you want to make sure that asset stays in the family." The words felt harsh but necessary, like cleaning an infected wound that had been festering beneath polite family dynamics for months. David opened his mouth to object, but I held up my hand to stop him. "I don't need your explanations or your justifications. What I need is for you to understand that some lessons can't be unlearned once they've been taught. Tonight you've shown me exactly who you are when you think there are no consequences for cruelty, and you've shown me exactly who you become when you discover there might be consequences after all. Neither version is someone I recognize as the son I raised." The grandfather clock in our hallway chimed 10 o'clock, marking time that felt simultaneously endless and insufficient for the conversation that was ending our relationship as father and son in any meaningful sense. David left that night without another word, and I never saw him again except for brief glimpses around town. Always at a distance, always hurried, always avoiding eye contact like a stranger who'd once borrowed money and never paid it back. 6 months later, I received notice that he'd moved to Seattle, pursuing opportunities that apparently required 3,000 miles of distance from the family complications he'd created but couldn't resolve. Respect your elders while you still can. You never know what you're inheriting or losing, and by the time most people learn this lesson, the classroom has permanently closed. The irony wasn't lost on me that David had achieved exactly what his note had demanded. I'd found another place to live, emotionally speaking, a space where family obligations didn't include tolerating cruelty from people who should have known better. The difference was that my new residence came with financial independence and moral clarity that his version of freedom would never provide. Margaret's absence felt less crushing now, not because I missed her less, but because I'd stopped trying to maintain relationships that dishonored her memory through their dysfunction. She'd raised our son to be better than what he'd become, and preserving his capacity for cruelty wasn't the legacy she'd worked 47 years to create. The charitable organizations that inherited our accumulated wealth used it exactly as Margaret would have hoped, funding cancer research that might spare other families the agonizing losses we'd endured, supporting hospital programs that treated patients regardless of their ability to pay, creating opportunities for children whose parents worked multiple jobs to provide security we'd built through careful planning and mutual sacrifice. Every quarterly report from these foundations felt like validation that our money was finally serving its highest purpose, generating value that extended far beyond any individual family's comfort or convenience. I lived simply in the house that would someday belong to St. Mary's Hospital, maintaining Margaret's gardens, preserving her traditions, honoring memories that felt sacred rather than burdensome when no one was around to roll their eyes at my grief or sigh at my stories. The loneliness was real but clean, honest solitude that beat dishonest company every time. Sometimes I wondered if David ever thought about that note, whether he'd kept copies of the real estate articles he'd surely discovered, whether he'd calculated exactly how much his cruelty had cost him in practical terms. $4 million was a conservative estimate, not including compound growth that smart investments might have generated over decades of patient management. His children, grandchildren I'd never meet, would grow up without the financial advantages that generational wealth could have provided, all because their father had confused temporary irritation with permanent character assessment. But the real cost wasn't monetary. David had traded a relationship with a man who'd shaped his opportunities for the illusion of independence from family obligations that felt inconvenient. He'd chosen immediate emotional comfort over long-term connection, temporary relief from grief-related awkwardness over lifetime benefits of unconditional love. The math was brutal in ways that accounting couldn't capture. He'd lost more than money, more than inheritance, more than security. He'd lost the chance to learn from someone who'd loved him before he was successful, who'd sacrificed for him before he was grateful, who'd believed in him before he'd believed in himself. Now he was truly alone in ways that success could never fix, wealth could never heal, and achievement could never satisfy. If this story made you think about your own family, tell me in the comments. What's something your parents sacrificed that you only understood years later? And parents, what do you wish your children knew about your struggles? Let's heal these family wounds together, because dignity isn't about pride, it's about teaching respect while there's still time to learn it. When we tolerate cruelty from people we love, we're not preserving relationships, we're enabling their destruction from the inside out. Don't forget to subscribe, because this old father has more stories about the price of taking family for granted, and trust me, the tuition for these lessons only gets more expensive with time. Love your people while you have them, respect the sacrifices they've made for your benefit, and remember that family wealth isn't just financial. It's emotional, and once you've spent that capital carelessly, the bank account closes forever.